Hi everyone, over the past month I've been working on this forest scene for my game. I ran into many problems with optimization and I want to share what I've learned to help you save some time. This scene uses Nanite, Lumen and virtual shadow maps. I'll show you here. For example, if we go to view mode, Nanite visualization, triangles, uses Nanite landscape, foliage and everything's Nanite. The level of detail is amazing. You can see the draw distance is very big. It uses dynamic lighting from ultra dynamic sky. It uses ultra dynamic weather. I have a day and night cycle, so we'll be optimizing for that as well. You can see shadows from all the trees are drawn. So for example, if I go here, there are tree shadows on the other side. So in the editor and while I'm recording, this scene usually gets around 55 FPS, but once you compile the game, you usually get 5 to 10 FPS back. I started at around 30 FPS and now it runs smoothly at 60 FPS. We'll cover Lumen, Nanite, temporal super resolution, virtual shadow maps, virtual textures. This project uses all these latest technologies. So for example, the forest was generated with PCG graph. Also, you might have noticed that my scalability settings are set to high. It's because I wasn't able to optimize it for epic settings. And I'm getting around 40 FPS, but high scalability settings looks good enough for me. To be fair, I don't really see much difference between high and epic scalability settings. So as you can see, everything is Nanite on the scene, including the grass, rocks, and the trees. You can see the landscape is using Nanite, although it doesn't use the tessellation. Later in the video, I'll explain to you why I chose not to use tessellation, and we'll see how it impacts the performance when you turn it on. So now let's talk about the specs you need to run the compiled game at 60 FPS at Full HD resolution. I have an older but still powerful Ryzen 2700X. You'll need at least 16 gigabytes of RAM to run the game, but I really recommend 32 gigabytes for the development, and you might need more RAM if you're using Nanite Landscape, and we'll talk about that later in the video. And most importantly, I have an RTX 4060 with 8 gigabytes of RAM. I'll show you how to optimize the video memory and the textures in this video. Let's begin with creating the project. To start optimizing, set your quality preset to scalable from maximum. When you set your quality preset to scalable, it changes some of your rendering settings. I will leave my config in the description below and we'll go over it in the end. Using it, you can apply the settings to an existing project and help make it run much better. I also recommend enabling ray tracing, and we'll go over the settings in a second. So right now you can see my FPS went down by a lot. That's because I disabled Nanite, and you can see the draw distance is quite small. This is because I want to show the difference between using Nanite, virtual shadow maps, and how they all impact the performance. So on the existing project, or when you create a new project, go to Edit, Project Settings, scroll down to Rendering section. Here, you scroll down to Global Illumination, make sure Lumen is selected, Reflection Method, Lumen. Also check Use Hardware Ray Tracing when available. If you can't check this option, enables hardware ray tracing support down here. Then, because we'll be using Nanite, we switch from shadow maps to virtual shadow maps. For software ray tracing mode, you can select detail tracing or global tracing. I didn't see much difference in the performance, but apparently global tracing performs better, so I will be selecting that. We won't be using ray trace shadows. We will be using Nanite. Generate mesh distance fields should be enabled by default when you switch to Lumen, I believe. Double check that this is enabled. Then if you scroll down to anti-aliasing method, choose temporal super resolution. Also, if you use my config file that I have attached in the description below, all these settings should be applied for you along with some extra console commands, so you can just double check that these are all selected. One more thing I forgot to add is that you need to enable virtual texture support over here in the rendering settings. We will talk about how this helps with memory usage later in the video. So now that we're back in the editor, let's talk about the textures and optimizing video memory. When I initially made this forest, I had an warning message in the top left corner saying that I ran out of video memory and my performance in the editor was really bad. So there are two things you can do to fix this issue. First, if you go to your textures and, for example, open them, here you can find an option called maximum texture size. If you're using 8K textures, or for example, this is a 4K texture, you can set this value to, for example, 248 to use a 2K texture. This will improve your video memory usage by a lot. To change multiple textures at the same time, you can select texture in the filters here. You can just take a texture here. Then you select your textures, right-click them, Asset Actions, Edit Section in Property Matrix. Here you can find the maximum texture size option, and this will be applied to all the textures you have selected. You can play around with these settings, try to lower it down to 2K first, and then if you're still out of memory, try 1K textures. Then you can see my textures has a little VT sign over here. This is because these are virtual textures and they really help with the memory usage as well. To convert your textures to virtual textures, you select them, right-click, and then you will have an option Convert to Virtual Texture. After you change your textures to virtual, your materials might be broken. To fix this, go to your material, open your master material, and here what you're looking for is this kind of nodes. So when you click on this node, you can scroll down and you'll see a sampler type. If it was selected color, choose virtual color. If it was, for example, normal, switch to virtual normal. And as a placeholder, you need to select a virtual texture as well. So just over here in the base color, select any virtual textures that you have. And here in the material instance, you can change those placeholder textures to the actual textures that you will be using. So now let's talk about the landscape. I'm not using virtual texture for the landscape because I couldn't get my master material to work with no errors. So this is just a regular texture on my landscape, and let's convert it to Nanite. Before you do that, click on your landscape and check the resolution of your landscape. So initially my landscape had an 8K resolution and I had 16 gigabytes of RAM. When I tried to convert my 8K landscape to Nanite, my editor would crash every time. This is because there was not enough RAM in my system. I had 16 gigabytes of RAM. I've read online that for an 8K landscape, you need around, I think it was more than 100 gigabytes to convert it to Nanite. If you wish to keep your 8K landscape and still convert to Nanite, here's what you need to do. You need to convert your level to world partition. You go to Tools and then Convert Level. This might take some time. Then you load some cells of the landscape in the world partition. You select them and you convert them to Nanite. Then you unload them from world partition, select different cells, and then convert those to Nanite. A few cells at a time, you will be able to convert your whole landscape to Nanite. But my landscape is quite a low resolution, so I have 48 gigabytes of RAM, and here's how you can enable Nanite on it. You select your landscape, you scroll down to Nanite, enable Nanite, and then build data. So since my landscape is quite a low resolution, it didn't take much time. And as you can see, we got some artifacts right here. Before that, the way I was able to fix those is changing Nanite position precision from 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters. But as you can see now, it's still broken. It might not be broken for you, but this is because I'm using ultra dynamic weather. To fix this, open up your landscape material, then scroll down and find the master material. And here, deselect pixel depth offset from make material attributes. Then click apply and save. Now you can see all the artifacts are gone. You can kind of see some gaps in from far away, but if you go closer, those gaps disappear. So don't worry about those. So now you can notice that there isn't much performance impact, at least on my landscape, from converting it to Nanite. But let's say we want to experiment with tessellation. You can double check that your landscape uses Nanite by going to view modes, Nanite visualization, triangles. You can see my triangles are quite big. So now let's try to enable tessellation. The way you do that is you go to your landscape material, search for tessellation, and enable tessellation. Click save, and let's see what happens. So as you can see, we lost some FPS. Visually, the landscape stayed the same, as you can see. So for example, this beach material right here, it just uses normal maps, no tessellation. So I don't think you should be enabling tessellation unless you really need to. This is because it really impacts the performance. So I will be disabling tessellation for my landscape. So now let's convert our foliage to Nanite. The way you do that is you filter by static mesh right here. Again, you can right click and select static mesh here. You select all your meshes, right click, Nanite, enable Nanite. And now you can see our trees have Nanite meshes. If we go to view mode, Nanite, triangles, you can see everything is Nanite now. And as you can see, we only gained frames per second, and now our render distance is huge. So I can see the trees from this far, and each of those trees have a shadow. So to make your foliage look better at a distance, you can select all your static meshes that are using Nanite, right-click them, Asset Actions, Edit Section in Property Matrix. Here, make sure Preserve Area is on, and you can change the Keep Triangle percent to, let's say, 50, 75%. But my trees are not really high resolution. So as you can see here, it doesn't really have millions and millions of triangles. So I won't be changing that. Another way you can optimize your foliage is by modeling each individual leaf. So for example, here you can see the leaves are 2D, and Nanite doesn't work well with a opacity mask. So it's better to model each of your leaves as a 3D mesh. Same goes for grass, but as you can see here, it works pretty well on my machine, so I won't be changing that. So you can see on my level, I have a wind system, and you can see the trees are moving, the grass is moving as well. By default, every time the tree moves, the shadow gets recalculated. This really impacts the performance, and I'll show you how to fix those. To see if that's an issue for you, you can click on View Modes, Virtual Shadow Map, and Cached Page. You can see everything is green, and I'll show you how to make it this way. So if you're using the foliage tool, you will see the same settings as I'm showing here. If you're using PCG Craft, find this node and search for Shadow Cache Invalidation Behavior. Set this to rigid. I'll show you what happens if I set it to auto. So now you can see all the pages shown are blue. This is because the shadow gets recalculated every frame, and you can see the FPS went down. So to fix this, just set it to rigid. If you're using a PCG Craft, you can also set a cool distance for each of your meshes. Mine's are set to 170,000. For Nanite and for this kind of forest, I saw that it doesn't really impact the performance that much. This is because Nanite meshes can occlude each other, so the trees over there in the distance won't be drawn at all if you're somewhere here. So you can try and experiment with that value, but for me, it didn't make much impact, so I just left it at a large value. So now let's talk about the grass. You might have already noticed that I don't have shadows on my grass. This is because in the forest scene, a lot of it is already in the shadow, so I just disabled it. The way you do that, I have a procedural foliage tool, and I'll show you here, for example. You can see that my affect distance, field lighting, cast dynamic shadow, cast context shadow are all disabled for the foliage. And that's how you disable shadow for your procedural foliage. Now that you set it to rigid, you can limit the distance at which your trees will be moving. So for example, the trees over there in the distance won't be affected by the wind. You can configure that by changing the world position offset disable distance. Mine set to 20,000 for the trees, and it will be a lower value ideally for the grass. And here in the grass settings, you can also see world position offset disable distance. If you set it to 0, the grass will be affected by wind at any distance, but mine is set to 1 for some, and for the others I set it to 2000. And of course, for grass, since we have a lot of grass on the ground, it's a good idea to set a call distance for the grass. So for example, over there in the distance, you won't be able to see the grass, so we might as well call it. You can configure that value here in start call distance and end call distance. Mine's set to 5,000 for some, and 1,800 for really small grass. One more tip to save you some research time. If you go to stat GPU, when I hit play, because my sun will be moving, since I have a day-night cycle, my shadow depths goes up to 6 milliseconds. And I thought that by limiting the distance at which shadows are cast for the trees, so now you can see I got shadows over there, even though I can't really see them. I thought that by lowering the distance to the camera and disabling shadows at a distance, it will help the performance. It was really hard to find a console command that lowers the distance for the shadow. For normal shadow maps, that option is exposed in the directional light, but for virtual shadow maps, you don't have that option. So you have to enter a console command, and when I finally found it after many hours of research, it just didn't improve the performance at all. So I just recommend you leaving that as it is. So all the trees on that side of the island will still have a shadow, and you can see it over there. So another tip I have for you is that if you're experiencing any kind of ghosting effects, you can't really see it right now. So these commands are already included in my config. If you're not using my config, here's what you need to do. I will leave these commands in the description below. You set this value to 0, and then a distant threshold to 0.2. So these two commands should help fix any flickering that you have on the foliage and the landscape from shadows and from trees moving. If that doesn't help, try going to your landscape material and disabling world position offsets and pixel depth offset. So I think that's pretty much it. I believe this scene is now optimized for any weather condition. We don't have any flickering. The FPS is quite stable. So I'm quite happy with the results. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. So now let's talk about the config that is attached in the description below. There I will only include hardware targeting settings. So here you can see apply default graphics performances, scalable instead of maximum. and render settings. These are the most important ones. To find your config, you go to your project folder, then config, and then there you'll find DefaultEngine.ini. When you open up my config, what you need to do, first of all, save your config somewhere on your machine. So if something goes wrong, you can always go back to your previous config. But once you have two configs open, you just copy these commands and you paste them into your config. And then if something goes wrong, try to removing some of these commands. So for example, I don't know, half of them, and see if the issue is still there. And then in the worst case scenario, you can always leave me a message in the comments and I'll reply to you. So these are the key optimizations I learned while developing this project over the past month. I hope this helps you. You can find my config in the description below. If you have any questions, leave a comment. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and good luck with your projects.